What if the true soul of ancient Britain wasn't Roman, but Celtic picture? A time when the rugged hills and misty shores of the British Isles echoed with the chants of druids, the rumble of chariots, and the songs of warrior kings. Long before Caesar's legions marched across the Channel, a powerful and deeply rooted culture flourished in these lands, one of mystery, resilience, and spiritual depth. This is the story of the Celtic Britons, a civilization often overshadowed by their conquerors, but whose legacy still pulses beneath the surface of modern Europe. In this episode, we travel from stone circles and sacred groves to the front lines of Roman invasions and beyond. If you're captivated by the hidden histories of ancient peoples, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sleep Stories TV, where the past comes alive one story at a time. The British Isles have always been lands of layered ancient cultures. The story of the British Isles does not begin with the Romans, the Saxons, or even the Celts. These wind-swept lands have been inhabited for tens of thousands of years, shaped by an extraordinary tapestry of human migration, cultural development, and environmental transformation. Long before written history began, Britain and Ireland were home to complex societies, peoples who hunted reindeer across frozen tundras during the Ice Age, who raised towering monoliths during the Neolithic, and who traded tin and gold during the Bronze Age. The British Isles have always been a land of layered ancient cultures, each one building upon the last, leaving behind echoes in language, art, and myth. Geographically, the Isles are not a single unit, but a constellation of islands, mountains, forests, moors, and valleys. This fragmented landscape helped shape the deep cultural diversity that would define them. Isolation by mountains or sea meant that different communities developed their own customs, beliefs, and languages. Yet paradoxically, the proximity of these islands to mainland Europe also ensured that they were never truly cut off. Ideas, goods, and people flowed in and out of these shores constantly. From the earliest times, the British Isles have been a meeting place, a threshold between the Atlantic and the continent, between isolation and interaction. Archaeological discoveries show that even prehistoric inhabitants of Britain maintained expansive trade networks. Obsidian from the Mediterranean, amber from the Baltic, and tin from Cornwall were traded over enormous distances. This wasn't some forgotten corner of the ancient world, it was part of a vast web of connections. With each new wave of settlers, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age metallurgists, the human imprint on the land deepened. They constructed monumental sites like Stonehenge, Avebury, and Newgrange, sacred spaces aligned with the stars and seasons used not only for ritual purposes, but also for social gatherings, astronomical tracking, and tribal identity. This depth of history shaped the British Isles into a place of immense cultural memory. When we speak of Celtic Britain, it is only one chapter, albeit a vital one, in this long saga. The Celts themselves were not the first inhabitants, nor were they ever truly unified under one flag or identity. But when they did emerge, they became one of the most defining cultural forces in Britain's ancient past. Their language, art, and worldview seeped into the soil, giving rise to legends and oral traditions that still persist today. Yet their story is often told only as a prelude to the Roman invasion, as if their significance was merely to be conquered. That perspective fails to recognize how layered and enduring their contribution truly was. To understand the Celtic Britons and the many other peoples who came before and after them, we need to abandon the idea of ancient Britain as a blank slate waiting to be civilized by Rome. In truth, the island was already alive with culture. Across its hills and valleys, people built hill forts, carved symbols into stone, told complex mythologies, and observed seasonal rituals that governed their connection to nature and the cosmos. Each layer of culture did not erase the previous one, but mingled with it. When the Romans arrived, they did not land on uncharted shores. They stepped into a world with its own logic, order, and memory. These layers still live in the landscape. The names of rivers, mountains, and forests often come from forgotten tongues. Many traditions, from fire festivals to burial rites, trace their roots to pre-Roman customs. Even after centuries of conquest, assimilation, and suppression, the echo of ancient Britain still hums in the stones and the soil. That is what makes the British Isles so compelling, not just their history, but the continuity of it. Each culture left something behind, a pattern in the earth, a word in the language, a whisper in the myth. As we begin our journey into the story of the Celtic Britons, we must start with this essential truth, that they were not born in a vacuum, nor did they vanish into one. They were part of an ever-turning wheel of civilizations whose layers are still being unearthed, interpreted, and brought back to life. In exploring their past, we are also peeling back the strata of human experience in these isles, from the earliest hunter-gatherers to the sophisticated tribal societies that stood firm against empires. The British Isles were never static, never simple. They have always been lands of layered ancient cultures, and the Celts, vibrant and enigmatic, were one of the most brilliant among them. Celtic Britons existed long before Roman legions crossed the Channel, long before the polished sandals of Roman legionaries touched the sands of Kent. The Celtic Britons had already carved out a deep and enduring presence across the British Isles. These were not crude or nomadic peoples waiting to be civilized by Roman order. They were heirs to millennia of cultural development, their roots stretching back into the mists of prehistory. By the time Julius Caesar gazed across the Channel toward Britain in the 1st century BCE, the Celtic Britons had already formed sophisticated tribal societies, maintained vast trade networks, and practiced religious and cultural rituals that would confuse and intrigue their Roman observers. The label Celtic is a modern convenience for describing these Iron Age peoples, but in truth, they would not have recognized that term. They identified by tribe, by lineage, and by land. Names like the Catavalloni, the Brigantes, and the Trinovantes held real meaning, defining not only territory, but ancestry, allegiance, and honor. What unified these distinct groups was not a central government or imperial ambition, but a shared cultural ethos, one rooted in warrior values, oral tradition, and reverence for the natural world. Their society valued courage, kinship, and continuity with history, preserved not through writing, but through generations of storytellers, poets, and priests. Evidence of their presence is etched into the landscape. Hill forts, often mistakenly thought of as purely military, were centers of tribal governance, storage, and communal life. Burial mounds dotted the countryside, testifying to belief systems that revered ancestors and celebrated passage into the other world. Artifacts found in burial sites, ornate torques, cauldrons, and intricately patterned jewelry speak to a refined aesthetic sensibility and skilled craftsmanship. They were not only warriors, but metalworkers, builders, artists, and religious devotees. Their societies revolved around more than survival. They were deeply structured with social hierarchies, tribal laws, and roles for priests, artisans, and farmers. The Celtic Britons also had a profound connection to their environment. Forests, rivers, mountains, and even mists were believed to be inhabited by spirits and gods. Sacred groves served as sites for ritual and reflection. Offerings sometimes of weapons, other times of food, or even human lives were made in lakes and bogs given to the divine forces that animated the land. These were not primitive superstitions, but integral parts of a belief system that wove nature and the supernatural into every aspect of life. The spiritual role of druids, who functioned as advisors, healers, philosophers, and judges, further illustrates the complexity of their worldview. Even Rome, which saw itself as the pinnacle of civilization, was forced to reckon with the cultural depth it encountered in Britain. Roman writers, including Julius Caesar himself, often describe the Britons with a mixture of awe and disdain. They were savage, yes, but noble. Barbaric, yet brave. The contradictions reveal a subtle respect the Romans may have viewed them as the other, but they were an other worthy of conquest. In battle, they met legions with roaring war cries, painted faces, and whirling chariots, forms of warfare that baffled the disciplined ranks of Rome, but which drew from centuries of martial tradition, rooted in tribal identity and ritualized conflict. Before Rome's expansion reached the British shores, the Celts were already veterans of cultural diffusion and defense. They had seen trade routes bring luxury goods and foreign ideas, had adapted technologies like ironworking into their own societal framework, and had established tribal alliances and rivalries that spanned entire regions. To describe them as isolated is to ignore the constant churn of influence that flowed between Britain and the continent. They had their own economies, their own coinage, and their own systems of political negotiation. And they were deeply conscious of their past, carrying myths and legends that explained the world-shaped morality and instructed future generations in courage and loyalty. What's striking is how long they endured. Despite waves of invasion and centuries of change, many Celtic traditions persisted. The arrival of the Romans marked a tectonic shift. Yes, but it was not an erasure. Celtic languages continued to be spoken. Celtic deities were merged with Roman ones. Hill forts remained symbols of power, even when Rome built its stone villas and bathhouses nearby. The Celts, for all the forces that pressed upon them, proved remarkably resilient. Their identity evolved, but it never vanished. When we reflect on the idea that the Roman conquest brought civilization to Britain, we risk erasing the millennia that came before it, the culture that thrived, resisted, and adapted on its own terms. The Celtic Britons were not blank slates to be written upon. They were authors of their own story long before the Roman eagle cast its shadow over Albion. Their voices, though quieted by time, still echo in the surviving fragments of language, in place names and folklore, and in the very soil of the British Isles. And if we listen closely, we can still hear them speaking. Their language and identity once dominated all corners of the Isles. There was a time when the Celtic tongue echoed from every corner of the British Isles. From the northern highlands of Scotland to the rolling hills of southern England, from the green valleys of Wales to the rugged shores of Ireland, the language of the Britons was the common thread that stitched together a fragmented land. Before Latin reached the island, before Anglo-Saxon dialects laid their roots, and before English existed in any form, Celtic languages were the lifeblood of communication, identity, and story across the Isles. These were not monolithic languages, but a family of closely related dialects that evolved locally and flourished regionally, collectively known as Insular Celtic. These tongues can be divided into two main branches. Goidelic, spoken in Ireland and parts of Scotland, and Brythonic, used throughout much of Britain, including what would later become Wales, Cornwall, and parts of southern Scotland. Over time, these branches gave rise to the languages we still recognize today: Irish, Scottish, Gaelic, Manx, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. But during their peak, these languages were far more than mere tools for communication. They were carriers of history vessels of myth and the soundscape of a world before conquest. In Celtic societies where literacy was rare and tradition was oral language was sacred, it wasn't just how people talked, it was how knowledge was preserved. Elders and druids held vast stores of information in memory genealogies, laws, prophecies, heroic tales, and songs. These oral traditions could span generations and required immense skill to recite and transmit. To speak the language was to be part of a living history tied not just to one's tribe, but to a shared cultural consciousness that extended across the Isles. This linguistic unity did not mean political unity. Celtic Britain was fractured into dozens of tribes, each with its own territory and leadership. But their shared linguistic roots fostered a kind of pan-regional understanding. Even if dialects differed, the foundational grammar and vocabulary often allowed mutual intelligibility, especially between neighboring tribes. A warrior from southern Britain could in many cases understand the general meaning of a speech delivered by a chieftain from across the mountains. It was a linguistic landscape of diversity nested within kinship. The spread of the Celtic languages also reveals the cultural confidence of the people who spoke them. They were not just confined to Britain. When waves of Britons fled later invasions, they carried their speech to new lands. In Brittany, on the northwestern tip of France, the descendants of British refugees founded communities that still speak a form of Brythonic Celtic to this day, Breton. It is a living reminder that the Celtic linguistic world once extended far beyond the shores of Britain itself. The endurance of these languages through centuries of pressure is a testament to the deep roots they held. Even after the Roman conquest, Latin failed to supplant Celtic tongues among the rural population. Latin was the language of law administration and the elite, but the farmers, shepherds, and laborers continued to speak their native tongues. In the hills and highlands, where Rome's reach was weakest, Celtic languages remained unchallenged. They were spoken in homes, sung in fields, and whispered in sacred groves. Where Latin needed education, Celtic language needed only memory. Yet the survival of these languages was not just a passive occurrence. It required fierce cultural resilience. As new powers arrived, Romans, Saxons, Normans, the speakers of Celtic languages were often pushed further into the margins of their own land. Still, they held on. In Wales and Ireland, Celtic identity became synonymous with defiance and endurance. To speak the language was not only to remember the past, but to resist erasure. Even today, these ancient languages are still alive, though not without struggle. Welsh boasts hundreds of thousands of fluent speakers and a strong revival movement. Irish is taught in schools and remains a national language. Scottish Gaelic holds on in the Highlands and Islands. Cornish and Manx, once considered dead, are being revived by passionate communities. Breton, though fading, is still spoken in parts of France. Their persistence speaks to a deep cultural pride, a refusal to let go of something so fundamental to identity. The Celtic languages are not just tools of speech. They are keys to understanding an ancient worldview. Embedded within them are concepts and values that defy easy translation into modern English. Words for community, kinship, landscape, and honor that carry centuries of tradition and emotion. When a person speaks Welsh or Irish or Gaelic today, they are not just using sounds passed down through time, they are invoking an ancestral connection, reaching back to a world of hill forts and meadows, druids and warriors, gods and ghosts. Once, the Celtic voice was the voice of Britain. It sang through every valley, every glen, every stretch of moorland. Its decline was not natural, but the result of conquest, displacement, and policy. And yet, despite the weight of history, that voice was never fully silenced. It speaks still, in songs, in poems, in place names, in whispers, passed from parent to child. It is the sound of a people who endured. In modern times, Celtic culture survives in only scattered regions. Today, the grand cultural footprint of the ancient Celts has been reduced to scattered echoes. Whispers of a once vast presence now confined to the edges of the British Isles. Where Celtic languages and traditions once flourished across all of Britain and Ireland, they now persist only in a few determined enclaves, clinging to survival in the westernmost corners of the modern map. This survival, however, is more than historical inertia. It is a conscious, ongoing act of cultural preservation, resistance, and revival. Take Wales, for instance, a nation where the Welsh language, a direct descendant of ancient Brittonic, is still spoken by hundreds of thousands. Despite centuries of Anglicization and suppression, the Welsh people have fought to maintain their linguistic and cultural identity. Road signs appear in 2 languages, schools teach in Welsh, and public broadcasting regularly features content in the native tongue. Yet even here, the survival of Celtic culture is a constant battle against the encroachment of English as the dominant cultural force. In Scotland, the situation is more precarious. Scottish Gaelic, once the dominant language of the Highlands, is now spoken by fewer than 60,000 people, concentrated mostly in the Western Isles. While Gaelic enjoys a symbolic status and revival efforts exist through language schools and media, its use in everyday life continues to decline. The same story is told in Ireland. Though Irish is the first official language of the Republic and taught in schools, it is fluently spoken by a minority, mostly in Gaeltacht areas along the western coast. In many communities, English has long since replaced it as the primary medium of communication. Elsewhere, the outlook is even bleaker. Manx, the language of the Isle of Man, officially died with the passing of its last native speaker in the 20th century. Though today, thanks to revitalization efforts, a small but growing number of people are learning it again. Cornish similarly disappeared from daily use for centuries, but has been revived in recent decades by passionate language activists. The language is now taught in some schools, used in cultural events, and spoken in limited community settings. Breton, the Celtic language of northwestern France, faces perhaps the most acute crisis. Despite being spoken by over 1 million people in the early 20th century, it has been aggressively marginalized by the French state's assimilation policies. Now, only a small fraction of the population speaks it fluently, most of them elderly. In all of these places, Celtic identity has endured, but often only as a symbol. Flags, music festivals, and mythic tales keep the spirit alive, even as the everyday reality of Celtic life fades. Celtic knots decorate jewelry. Bagpipes sound at national events. Tartan patterns and ancient surnames offer connection to a deeper past. Yet beneath the aesthetics lies a more sobering truth. The culture that once defined these lands is now pushed to their edges, both geographically and socially. Still, there is hope. Across the Celtic fringe, a cultural renaissance has taken root. Young people are reclaiming their languages and histories, reconnecting with the traditions that colonialism, conquest, and modernization sought to erase. Immersion schools are producing new generations of fluent speakers. Musicians are reviving traditional instruments and songs, blending them with modern sounds to create powerful fusions of old and new. Poets and storytellers are once again using ancient languages to craft contemporary art. Even digital platforms, social media podcasts, YouTube have become tools for revival, allowing isolated communities to network, share resources, and inspire each other. Beyond the British Isles and Brittany, Celtic culture has taken on a powerful symbolic role in the global diaspora. In Canada, the United States, Australia, and parts of South America, descendants of Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and Breton immigrants embrace their heritage as a source of pride. Festivals like Celtic Connections, the National Eisteddfod, and Face Non Guide Heel celebrate language music and dance, drawing people together across continents. For many in the diaspora, Celtic culture offers both a spiritual link to their ancestors and a way to navigate modern identity through the lens of resilience and belonging. The romanticization of Celtic culture in literature and pop culture has also played a role in sustaining global interest. From the haunting ballads of Irish folk music to the magical landscapes of fantasy novels inspired by Welsh mythology, the aesthetic and symbolic power of the Celts continues to resonate. However, this popularity can be a double-edged sword. It risks commodifying and simplifying a deeply nuanced and diverse cultural legacy into marketable stereotypes. While global fascination can drive curiosity and support, it must be paired with genuine respect and accurate representation. For those still living in the old Celtic homelands, the stakes are higher. Culture is not just a symbol, it is lived experience. Every lost speaker of a language, every ritual forgotten, every story untold, represents a thread, cut from a tapestry, centuries in the making. The question becomes not only how to preserve the past, but how to live it meaningfully in the present. The challenge facing modern Celtic communities is not only one of revival, but of relevance. Can ancient languages adapt to modern needs? Can rituals rooted in the agricultural cycles of old speak to urban lives today? Can heritage be more than nostalgia? The answer may lie in the strength of community. Where Celtic culture survives, it does so because communities have chosen to nurture it. Families teach their children native tongues. Local councils fund cultural initiatives. Artists use tradition as a wellspring of creativity. And in doing so, they are not merely remembering, they are renewing. The ancient Celts are often depicted as ghosts of a bygone era, but in these living communities, they remain present. Their spirit moves through language, song, and ritual, refusing to be forgotten. So while the dominance of Celtic identity over the Isles has receded, it has not disappeared. It survives in scattered regions, yes, but these regions are vibrant. They are strongholds of memory, creativity, and resistance. They are living proof that even the oldest voices can still be heard, if only we choose to listen. The origin of the Celts links to prehistoric Atlantic coastal networks. To understand where the Celts came from, we must look not to a single birthplace, but to a vast and ancient seascape, the Atlantic littoral, a maritime world stretching from Iberia in the south to Ireland in the north. Long before the word Celt was ever spoken, the peoples of this Atlantic coast were already connected by a rich web of trade-shared rituals and cultural values. These networks existed not across dry land, but over the shifting waves of the ocean. The Atlantic Ocean, far from being a barrier, was a highway, a shimmering thoroughfare along which ideas, goods, and customs flowed freely between distant communities. In the late Bronze Age, roughly between 1300 and 700 BCE, the coastal regions of Western Europe began to show signs of remarkable cultural convergence. Archaeologists have discovered nearly identical artifacts, warrior gear, like carp's tongue, swords, cauldrons, shields, and ceremonial wagons across regions as far apart as Ireland, Brittany, Cornwall, and northern Spain. These shared objects suggest more than coincidence. They point to the existence of a common cultural identity among these communities, a collective worldview that spanned hundreds of miles of coastline. These weren't centrally governed kingdoms, but scattered societies linked by seafaring elites, kinship traditions, and a common spiritual grammar. This early Atlantic culture challenges the older theory that Celtic identity originated in the inland regions of Central Europe, particularly in the Hallstatt and Latin cultures of the Alpine zone. While those inland traditions did contribute to what would later be called Celtic, there is growing evidence that some of the foundational elements, especially in terms of language and ritual, were already flourishing in the West, long before influences filtered in from Central Europe. In other words, the Celtic world may not have spread outward into Britain from the Alps, but may instead have emerged in parallel across a broad western zone with the Atlantic as its cultural spine. What made these Atlantic connections so powerful was not just shared tools or weapons, but shared belief systems. Across these regions, archaeological finds show a common practice of ritual deposition, precious objects deliberately placed in watery places such as lakes, rivers, and bogs. These offerings weren't discarded as waste. They were sacrifices to chthonic deities believed to dwell beneath the earth or water. The same religious logic appears again and again, from the wetlands of Ireland to the river valleys of Gaul. This consistency suggests a unified spiritual world, one passed from tribe to tribe, not through books or temples, but through oral tradition, seasonal festivals, and priestly ritual. Language too likely spread along these coastal routes. While the earliest Celtic languages have not survived, in written form, linguistic analysis shows remarkable continuity between the Goidelic and Brythonic tongues. Their root structures, phonetic systems, and grammar hint at a shared linguistic ancestor, one that may have spread not by conquest, but by prestige trade and intermarriage. Just as Latin later became the lingua franca of an empire, early forms of Celtic may have become the language of diplomacy and religion among these seafaring peoples. Language in this context was not only a means of communication, but a marker of elite identity. This raises a provocative possibility that the earliest Celts were not the wandering warriors of popular imagination, but rather seaborne aristocrats, traders, priests, and chieftains who moved between coastal communities, binding them into a shared ideological framework. The wealth of these early elites came not just from local resources, but from access to a broad trade zone. Tin from Cornwall gold, from Ireland, salt from Iberia, and even exotic items from the Mediterranean. These were the lifeblood of Bronze Age commerce, and those who controlled their movement held both power and prestige. Such wealth was often invested in grand monuments and burial rituals. The Atlantic coast is littered with cairns, barrows, and megaliths, stone structures that align with astronomical events and suggest sophisticated understandings of time and space. These structures, though built in different regions, share architectural features that imply a common ceremonial purpose. They were not built by the same hand, but by the same spirit, a spirit that valued continuity between the living and the dead, between this world and the next. In this cultural milieu, the concept of Celtic was not yet crystallized. There were no Celts in the modern sense, no ethnic group marching under a single banner. But there were the ingredients: shared language roots, shared sacred practices, shared elite symbols, and a shared seafaring lifestyle. These were the foundations upon which Celtic identity would later be built. What emerged in later centuries, tribes with names, totems, and warrior traditions, was born from this Atlantic crucible, shaped as much by ocean winds as by iron blades. This reinterpretation of Celtic origins doesn't erase the role of Central European cultures like Hallstatt and Latin, but it reframes them. Rather than being the sole source of Celtic identity, they may have been parallel developments, mutually influencing, mutually enriching. When the two cultural streams eventually met west and inland, they fused into the more recognizable forms of Celtic art warfare and religion that we associate with the Iron Age. Ultimately, the story of the Celts begins not with a single homeland, but with a network, one that flowed over the waves along cliffs and estuaries, past standing stones and burial mounds. It is a story written in salt and bronze, in fire and fog. The Atlantic coastal world was not merely a backdrop for Celtic emergence, it was the crucible. From its depths, a civilization rose that would one day defy empires and outlive conquest. Bronze Age. Britain was a vibrant hub of trade and craftsmanship. Before the rise of Rome, before the tribal kings of the Iron Age, and even before the flowering of Celtic culture. Bronze Age Britain was already a land of innovation, connection, and creativity, far from being an isolated or backward corner of prehistoric Europe. Britain during the second millennium BCE stood as a vital hub in a vast network of trade routes stretching across the continent and deep into the Near East. This was an age when metal was magic, when bronze became the key to tools, weapons, and social prestige, and Britain's place in this metallic revolution was nothing short of central. At the heart of Bronze Age Britain's importance was one specific resource: tin. While bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, the latter is relatively rare in most parts of Europe. However, southwestern Britain, particularly Cornwall and Devon, held some of the richest tin deposits on the continent. These deposits became the fuel for a continent-wide economy. From coastal settlements, British tin was transported by sea and river, passed from one tribe to another along the Atlantic facade, from Ireland and Gaul, all the way to the trading cities of the Mediterranean like Tyre and Ugarit. The people of Bronze Age Britain were not passive suppliers in this trade. They were active participants. Sophisticated boat designs, dugout canoes, sewn plank boats, and later larger vessels enabled long-distance maritime trade. Archaeological finds suggest the existence of regular and organized exchanges of goods, including not only tin, but also amber gold jet and finely worked textiles. In return, British elites received exotic goods, glass beads from the Levant, ornamental daggers, Mediterranean pottery, and perhaps even early wines and oils stored in amphorae. These foreign luxuries were more than curiosities. They were status symbols, tools of diplomacy, and markers of prestige. But the true heart of Bronze Age Britain was not just what it exported, it was what it created. Across the Isles, people of this era developed a remarkable tradition of craftsmanship. Metalworkers became the technological wizards of their age, fashioning elaborate blades, chisels, axes, and ornaments. Some of the finest artifacts of the period, like intricately cast swords with inlaid hilts, ceremonial daggers, and golden torques, demonstrate not only technical mastery, but also an evolving aesthetic sensibility. The spiral and geometric motifs that would later define Celtic art had their early echoes here in the embellishments of Bronze Age metalwork and jewelry. Beyond the smith's forge, other forms of craftsmanship flourished. Potters produced finely burnished ceramics, used in both everyday life and burial contexts. Textile workers created garments from flax and wool, dyed with natural pigments, and likely decorated with woven patterns. Woodworking was a highly developed art necessary for constructing longhouses, carts, boats, and furniture. The scale and coordination required for these projects reveal complex community structures with specialists, apprentices, and organized labor. One of the most awe-inspiring testaments to the achievements of Bronze Age Britons is their monumental architecture. Though the tradition began in the Neolithic, many of the most iconic megalithic sites, such as Stonehenge, were renovated and repurposed during the Bronze Age. These sites were not merely tombs or observatories. They were centers of ceremony, community gathering, and spiritual significance. The alignment of stones with celestial bodies suggests that the people of this era possessed detailed knowledge of astronomy and timekeeping. Whether for solstice rites, ancestral veneration, or tribal assemblies, these monuments reveal a society deeply in tune with both earth and sky. burial practices further illuminate the values of the time. High-status individuals were interred with grave goods that displayed their wealth and role in society. Warlords were buried with weapons and armor, chieftains with exotic trade goods, women of influence with ornate jewelry and mirrors. These burials were often conducted in barrows mound-like structures that dotted the countryside and served as lasting symbols of family legacy and tribal continuity. To passers-by, these barrows would have stood as constant reminders of ancestry power and the unbroken thread between the living and the dead. Social organization in Bronze Age Britain was complex. Although the exact nature of governance is debated, it is clear that hierarchies existed. Elite families controlled trade routes, land, and production. They commissioned the construction of hill forts and ceremonial sites, and they likely wielded both religious and political authority. At the same time, the broader population included farmers, herders, weavers, sailors, and smiths, each contributing to the economy and sustaining the intricate web of communal life. Religious belief during this period, though lacking written texts, was vivid and widespread. Gods and spirits were invoked through rituals involving firewater and sacrifice. Objects were often deposited into rivers, bogs, or wells, not discarded, but deliberately offered to unseen forces. The natural world was alive with meaning. Trees, stones, and springs were sacred. Seasonal festivals likely structured the agricultural calendar, and myths passed down through generations explained everything from the stars to sickness. This vibrant, creative, and highly organized society laid the groundwork for what would become Celtic Britain. The skills of the metalworker, the rhythms of ritual, the importance of kin and clan, and the deep spiritual connection to the land. All of these threads continued into the Iron Age and beyond. In fact, rather than being a cultural dead end, Bronze Age Britain was a launch point. It was here, amid the barrows and brooches, the hearth fires and harbor towns, that a uniquely Western identity began to coalesce, one that would shape the spirit of the Celts for centuries to come. It's easy to underestimate the achievements of prehistoric peoples, but when we look closely at the archaeological record, a different picture emerges, one of innovation, elegance, and connection. Bronze Age Britain was not a backwater. It was a beacon, its culture rippling outward across seas and generations. And even as the ages turned and empires rose, the echoes of this vibrant chapter still lived on in the language, art, and beliefs of the Celtic peoples who followed. Atlantic Celtic culture grew through shared rituals and warrior elites. As the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age, the tribal societies along the Atlantic coast of Europe, including those in Britain, Ireland, Brittany, and Iberia, began to share more than just trade routes. They developed a set of common values, artistic styles, and social structures centered around a unique combination of warrior prestige and sacred ritual. These cultural bonds, forged through centuries of interaction, helped shape what we now recognize as the early foundation of Atlantic Celtic identity. At the heart of this world was a powerful social class of warrior elites. These were not simply men who fought in defense of their clans. They were tribal nobles, community leaders, and symbols of divine favor. A warrior's value was not measured solely by the number of battles he won, but by how closely he embodied the virtues of strength, honor, generosity, and sacred duty. His role was as spiritual as it was military. Warfare for the Celts was not merely strategic, it was ceremonial. Victories were celebrated in feasts. Defeats were interpreted as omens, and weapons were often deposited into lakes and rivers as offerings to the gods. These elites were visually distinct. They adorned themselves with ornate jewelry, heavy torques of gold or bronze around their necks, intricately carved arm rings, and richly patterned clothing, dyed in vivid colors. Their weapons were just as symbolic as they were deadly. Long slashing swords, decorated shields, and helmets crowned with animal motifs were statements of power and identity. Possessing such equipment was not just a mark of wealth. It was a declaration of status within the tribe, passed down through generations and imbued with ancestral spirit. While warrior culture dominated the social order, it was intimately connected to a network of shared rituals and sacred beliefs. These rituals often revolved around feasting, a practice that transcended the act of eating and became a way of demonstrating generosity, hierarchy, and alliance. Tribal leaders hosted lavish banquets where whole communities gathered. Cauldrons recovered in both burial sites and sacrificial pits were large enough to feed dozens and were often elaborately decorated, suggesting their importance in both the secular and sacred realms. To share food at such events was to share in power and divine favor. Ritual offerings were central to Celtic religious life. Across the Atlantic, Celtic zone, similar patterns emerged: swords bent before being thrown into rivers, human remains buried in bogs, alongside personal ornaments, and great cooking vessels deliberately sunk into lakes. These acts were not random, they were deeply symbolic. The bending of a sword, for instance, may have signified the weapon's retirement to the spirit world or its transformation from tool of war to gift for the gods. The act of placing valuable or sacred objects in natural spaces suggests a belief in spirits residing within the earth and water, a recurring theme in Celtic spirituality. The landscape itself was alive to these people. Mountains, groves, rivers, and springs were not inert features. They were sacred beings, or doorways to the divine. Certain locations, especially those elevated or hidden in mist, became centers of pilgrimage and ritual. Sacred groves were tended by druids or spiritual elders, where rites of passage, seasonal festivals, and judicial rituals took place. These ceremonies reinforced not only spiritual cohesion, but also tribal identity, reminding participants of their connection to one another and to forces greater than themselves. One of the most fascinating aspects of Atlantic Celtic culture is how remarkably consistent its symbolic systems were across such vast distances. From Iberia to Ireland, one finds the same spiraling motifs carved into stones, the same types of ceremonial wagons buried with tribal elites, and the same weapon types deposited in watery graves. This kind of cohesion suggests more than coincidence. It points to shared ideology sustained by constant exchange. These societies were not isolated tribes mimicking each other from afar. They were part of a dynamic, interconnected cultural zone in which prestige items, religious practices, and noble lineages flowed like the tides that lapped at their shores. Oral tradition played a vital role in maintaining these bonds. Stories of divine heroes, ancestral warriors, and foundational myths were passed down by bards and priests who traveled between tribes and regions. These tales, rich with archetypes of battle betrayal, sacrifice, and transformation, reinforced social values and transmitted a common cosmology. While no writing remains from this period, echoes of these myths survive in later Celtic literature, from Wales, Ireland, and Brittany, where ancient motifs reappear again and again. The sacred well, the cursed blade, the god who walks among mortals. This combination of warrior ethos and sacred ritual created a distinct social order. Leadership was not only a matter of birth, but of spiritual legitimacy. A chieftain needed to be more than brave. He had to be ritually pure, able to commune with the gods, and generous enough to maintain loyalty through gifts and feasts. Power was a sacred trust, and to betray that trust invited not only rebellion, but cosmic imbalance. This worldview created a system in which religion, politics, and warfare were deeply intertwined. In many ways, the early Atlantic Celts set a pattern that would define their descendants for centuries. Their society prized bravery, honored the sacred, and remained rooted in the rhythms of land and season. It was a world in which community mattered more than conquest, where memory was preserved in song rather than stone, and where every sword raised in battle was also a prayer to the divine. Though the details would evolve and regional differences would grow, this early period laid the spiritual and social foundations of what it meant to be Celtic. When Rome eventually arrived with its bureaucracy, legions, and urban ideals, it encountered a culture as structured as it was symbolic. The Celtic world may not have had writing or empires, but it had cohesion, depth, and pride. It was not a blank canvas awaiting civilization, but a living mosaic of ritual, myth, and valor shaped over centuries by the wind and waves of the Atlantic world. Religion shaped early Celts through sacred lakes and sky gods. In the world of the early Celts, religion was not confined to temples or texts. It permeated every facet of existence. From the fog-draped valleys of Ireland to the rocky highlands of Britain and the windswept coasts of Gaul, the natural world was alive with spirit. Trees whispered ancient wisdom, rivers flowed with divine will, and thunder echoed the voice of the gods. Religion was not a separate institution. It was the pulse of Celtic life, and it shaped everything from warfare and law to seasonal rhythms and social hierarchy. Central to Celtic belief was a deep reverence for nature. Sacred lakes, bog springs, and rivers were not merely water sources. They were holy sites where mortals could commune with supernatural forces. Archaeological finds across Celtic lands reveal a recurring pattern. Prized weapons, ornate jewelry, cauldrons, tools, and even human remains placed deliberately into watery places. These were not discarded objects. They were ritual offerings, gifts to the gods, spirits, or ancestors. To submerge a finely crafted sword into a lake was to relinquish personal wealth in exchange for favor, protection, or spiritual balance. The more valuable the offering, the more potent the prayer. These water rituals were widespread. In Ireland, lakes like Lough Gur were known centers of spiritual activity. In Britain, the rivers Thames and Trent have yielded caches of Celtic artifacts buried deep in their mud. In Gaul, bronze statues and gold torques have been found in sacred springs. The repetition of this pattern across space and time suggests that it was not random, it was ritual. Water was not only a physical boundary, but also a spiritual threshold, a liminal zone between the human world and the other world. The Celtic otherworld was not a distant heaven or fiery underworld. It was a realm that coexisted with the world of the living, accessible through special places or moments in time. Groves, caves, islands, and wells could serve as gateways. Certain festivals, particularly Samhain and Beltane, were believed to thin the veil between the realms, allowing spirits to walk among mortals and mortals to glimpse the divine. This belief fed a spiritual culture in which gods and ancestors were not abstractions, but present forces whose influence could be felt in storms, dreams, and the flight patterns of birds. The gods themselves were as diverse and localized as the tribes who worshipped them. Unlike the highly organized pantheons of Greece and Rome, Celtic deities were often tribal, associated with particular landscapes or families. Yet across the Celtic world, certain archetypes recurred. The thunder god Tyrannus wielded sky and storm. The horse goddess Epona was protector of warriors and travelers. The sun god Belenus radiated healing and vitality. The horned god Cernunnos represented wilderness, fertility, and the cycles of life. These gods were not only worshipped, but deeply entangled with myth, ritual, and political power. It's important to understand that Celtic religion was not a passive set of beliefs. It was active, communal, and deeply performative. Sacred ceremonies were led by druids, the elite spiritual class whose role extended far beyond simple priesthood. Druids were judges, healers, astronomers, and philosophers. They mediated between the mortal world and the divine, presided over sacrifices, interpreted omens, and advised tribal leaders on matters both secular and sacred. Their authority came not from coercion, but from knowledge painstakingly memorized, passed down through generations, and never committed to writing. To become a druid was to undergo decades of rigorous training. Students learned law, ritual, natural medicine, oral poetry, and cosmology. In a world without written scriptures, memory was the vessel of faith, and the spoken word held immense power. Druidic gatherings were rumored to take place in deep forest sanctuaries, especially in groves of oak, a tree considered sacred for its strength, longevity, and association with lightning. Mistletoe, harvested ritually with golden sickles, was believed to hold healing and magical properties, especially when found on these sacred oaks. Celts saw no separation between religion and daily life. Every decision, when to plant, when to go to war, how to treat a guest, was guided by the rhythms of nature and the will of the gods. Festivals were central to this worldview, aligning with the agricultural calendar and marking key transitions in the year. Imbolc, Beltane Lugnasad, and Samhain were more than seasonal markers. They were sacred times when the community came together to feast, worship, renew vows, and honor the invisible threads that bound them to each other and to the unseen world. Even animals played religious roles. Bulls, horses, and boars were not just livestock. They were sacred beings associated with strength, fertility, and transformation. Birds, particularly ravens and crows, were seen as messengers between realms. In myths, shape-shifting deities and heroes often took animal forms, blurring the line between man, beast, and god. This fluidity was a hallmark of Celtic spirituality, a recognition that life was not fixed, but cyclical, and that the boundary between worlds was always shifting. The human body, too, was a site of religious symbolism. Tattoos, war paint, and ornamentation were not merely decorative. They signaled status, invoked protection, and embodied spiritual identity. Warriors entering battle often did so painted with blue dye from the woad plant, believing it conferred supernatural strength. Jewelry such as torques and arm rings were not just displays of wealth, but talismans infused with spiritual power, often believed to carry the favor of specific gods. Despite the diversity of deities and practices, a shared worldview united the Celtic peoples. The world was alive, interconnected, and cyclical. Life and death were not opposites, but part of a continuum. Time was not linear, but circular. Power did not come from dominance alone, but from harmony with the natural and spiritual realms. This belief system allowed communities to thrive in an unpredictable world, to find order in the chaos of nature, meaning in suffering, and identity in ritual. Later, Roman and Christian writers often misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented this worldview. They painted Celtic religion as barbaric, overly reliant on sacrifice and superstition. While it's true that ritual killings, animal, and occasionally human did occur, these acts were bound by strict codes and spiritual purpose, not mindless cruelty. They were expressions of a worldview in which death was transformation and blood an offering to the unseen. Today, echoes of this ancient religion remain. Place names, seasonal festivals, folklore, and rural customs all preserve fragments of the old faith. Even in our modern rituals, lighting candles, circling around fires, blessing water, we unconsciously echo practices rooted in Celtic belief. The lakes are quieter now. The sky gods no longer roar with the same thunder, but the memory remains woven into the land and waiting to be remembered. Common language and values emerged along the western sea routes, while many ancient societies developed their identities through land-based empires and centralized governance. The early Celtic world took shape along the shifting currents of the western seas. The Atlantic coastline, stretching from modern-day Portugal to the Hebrides, was more than a geographic boundary. It was a living conduit through which ideas, language, and shared values flowed with the tides. Along this watery highway, tribal communities communicated, traded, intermarried, and over time wove a cultural tapestry that stretched across thousands of kilometers, despite having no singular state or ruler. It was here, across this scattered maritime zone, that a common language family began to solidify. The people who lived along these coasts likely spoke mutually intelligible dialects of what we now call Proto-Celtic, a linguistic ancestor that would later split into the Goidelic and Brythonic branches. Though these tribes had no writing system to codify their speech, the similarities in grammar, vocabulary, and phonetics point to frequent contact and exchange. Language in this context was not imposed by conquest, but emerged organically through seaborne interaction. The sea did not divide them, it connected them. The tribes of this Atlantic world shared more than linguistic roots. They shared a set of cultural values that informed their political systems, religious practices, and social norms. Chief among these values was the concept of honor. In Celtic society, a person's reputation was their most valuable possession. Honor was maintained through acts of bravery, loyalty, generosity, and justice. A noble's word was binding. Hospitality was sacred, and cowardice was a source of lasting shame. These ideals transcended regional differences and were reflected in the laws, poetry, and heroic tales that survived long after the fall of the tribal system. Feasting, for example, was not just a celebration. It was a structured event where social roles were displayed and reinforced. The act of hosting a feast demonstrated wealth, generosity, and divine favor. Guests were seated according to rank. Bards recited the deeds of heroes. Warriors drank from communal vessels, while the chieftain sat enthroned, a living symbol of the tribe's honor. These ceremonies were nearly identical from Ireland to Gaul to southern Britain, pointing to a shared code of conduct rooted in kinship, loyalty, and sacred tradition. Kinship itself was central to Celtic social organization. Family was not just biological, it was tribal. Individuals identified themselves by clan or lineage, with ancestors playing a powerful role in the collective memory. Inheritance, leadership, and social obligation all stemmed from one's position within an extended kin network. These structures helped sustain order in the absence of formal states. Conflict resolution, for example, often relied on customary law administered by elders or druids rather than royal edicts or centralized courts. Marriage and alliances between clans often spanned great distances, facilitated by the Choir. Through these bonds, culture traveled. A daughter married into a far-off tribe might bring with her not only stories and songs, but also specific rituals, farming techniques, or artistic styles. In this way, ideas and traditions spread in waves, shaped by the tides as much as by bloodlines. Even the oral legends, tales of shapeshifters, sea gods, and warrior queens show remarkable consistency across the Atlantic Celtic zone, reinforcing the idea of a common cultural reservoir that drew from the same symbolic well. The spread of artistic motifs along these routes is another strong indicator of shared identity. From the Iberian Peninsula to Scotland, similar decorative patterns appear on metalwork, pottery, and stone carvings, swirling spirals, interlocking curves, animal forms, and complex knotwork. These designs were not merely aesthetic, they conveyed meaning. Spirals often symbolized cycles of life and death. Animals were associated with specific virtues: boars for courage, birds for prophecy, horses for nobility. This symbolic language was understood by communities hundreds of miles apart, further evidence of a unified mental and spiritual world. Maritime trade also played a key role in reinforcing these connections. Tin from Cornwall, copper from Ireland, salt from the Bay of Biscay, and gold from Iberia passed through hands and harbors with regularity. But the trade was not limited to goods, it extended to culture. A craftsman in Wales might incorporate techniques he learned from Gaulish traders. A bard in Brittany might recount stories with Irish echoes. The constant movement of people created a living cultural current that flowed alongside the material ones, keeping the Atlantic Celtic world vibrant and cohesive. The sea also shaped Celtic cosmology. Many myths speak of journeys across the water to mystical lands: Tir na Nog, the land of youth; Avalon, the Isle of Apples; or Emain Ablach, the blessed realm of the dead. These places were not just fictional, they reflected a real geographic sensibility. To the Celts, the West was not the end of the world, but the beginning of something sacred. The ocean was not terrifying, it was transformative. Death in many myths was imagined as a voyage across the water. Life itself was a journey with many landings. This seaborne perspective influenced even warfare. The Celts were not empire builders in the Roman sense, but their raids and migrations often followed the coastline. Groups like the Belgae Veneti and later the Gaels and Picts used their seafaring abilities to expand their influence. Ships allowed them to respond to threats, seek allies, or explore new territories. Control over harbors, river mouths, and coastal strongholds was just as strategically important as controlling inland resources. Maritime skill was both a military advantage and a cultural asset. Yet despite the strength of these bonds, the Celtic world remained politically decentralized. There were no Celtic emperors, no palaces of stone, no codified empire. But that did not mean disunity. The sea had already done the work of connecting. What the Celts shared was not a single flag, but a way of life, a code of values, and a sense of belonging that spanned forests, cliffs, and tides. Their unity was cultural rather than political, woven through language, ritual, and song. In the end, the western sea routes gave the early Celts something that no conqueror could easily erase: a living network of identity. This network was fluid, resilient, and adaptive qualities that would help Celtic culture survive even as foreign powers arrived to impose new orders. Though the tribal names would fade and the maps would change, the language and values carried along the Atlantic tide would remain etched in memory, whispered in legend, and sung in tongues that refused to die. Latin culture marked a golden age of Celtic artistic expression. If there was ever a golden age in the story of ancient Celtic civilization, it was during the time of the Latin culture. Emerging around 450 BCE and lasting for several centuries, Latin wasn't a political empire or a single kingdom. It was a cultural phenomenon, a flourishing of art, identity, and innovation that spread across Europe like wildfire. From the shores of Ireland to the edges of Anatolia, the Latin style became the visual language of Celtic pride and spiritual imagination. For the first time, the Celts left behind not just scattered artifacts or ritual offerings, but a fully realized artistic tradition that spoke of sophistication, symbolism, and unmatched creativity. Named after the archaeological site near Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where its distinct artifacts were first discovered, Latin was a cultural explosion that built upon earlier Celtic foundations. It was not born in isolation. It was the result of centuries of development in trade, metallurgy, and spiritual expression. But what made Latin special was the way it pulled all these threads together into a singular, recognizable, aesthetic, elegant, abstract, and deeply symbolic. At the heart of this cultural wave was a style of art unlike anything Europe had seen before. Instead of mimicking the realism of Greek sculpture or the rigid formality of early Mediterranean art, Latin designs celebrated movement curves and patterns. Spirals, triskelies, flowing tendrils, and animal forms were carved into weapons, jewelry, shields, and even ceremonial cauldrons. These weren't just decorations, they were visual expressions of a worldview rooted in cycles, transformation, and the mystery of the unseen. The motifs of La Tène were not just artistic flourishes, they were deeply spiritual. The spiral, for instance, symbolized eternity rebirth and the constant flow between the physical world and the other world. Animal imagery serpents, horses, birds, and wild boars conveyed divine protection, warrior power, or ancestral guidance. These symbols appeared on everything from battle gear to religious artifacts, reflecting a culture where art, myth, and identity were inseparable. Weaponry from the La Tène period was a fusion of function and beauty. Swords, often long and gracefully curved, were crafted with precision and adorned with elaborate hilts made from bronze, gold, and iron. Scabbards bore intricate engravings and colored inlays. Shields featured ornate central bosses and edge patterns blending utility with ceremonial pride. To carry such weapons was not merely to be armed, it was to carry a piece of one's culture and lineage into battle. Jewelry during this era reached new levels of refinement. Torque's thick metal neck rings became the defining symbol of high status. Often made of twisted gold or bronze, they were worn by warriors, chieftains, and deities alike in both life and burial. Bracelets, armlets, and brooches were equally extravagant, serving both practical and symbolic functions. They fastened cloaks and robes, but also served as amulets and identity markers. The wearers of such objects weren't just displaying wealth, they were making statements about their role in society, their lineage, and their divine favor. La Tène artisans were master metalworkers, but their talents extended beyond metallurgy. Wood, glass, enamel, and ceramics were also canvases for expression. Carved wooden objects from this period, though rarer due to decay, show patterns and designs consistent with the metalwork, indicating a shared symbolic vocabulary. Glass beads, often found in graves, were fashioned in vivid colors and swirling shapes, some believed to have protective properties or associations with the gods. Pottery, once purely utilitarian, now bore painted or carved designs, marking a growing emphasis on beauty in the everyday. What's striking is how widespread La Tène culture became. Its artistic style appears not just in Central Europe, but in regions as far as Britain, Ireland, Iberia, and even Galatia in modern-day Turkey, where Celtic tribes had migrated. This spread did not result from conquest alone. It was cultural magnetism. The La Tène aesthetic became fashionable, even aspirational, drawing other tribes into its orbit. Local variations emerged, but the core elements, flowing design, symbolic animal forms, intricate metalwork, remained consistent across thousands of miles. In Britain, La Tène culture took root particularly in the south and east, brought by trade migration and the rising prestige of continental Celtic elites. Hill forts, once simple earthworks, began to reflect the new cultural style with more organized layouts and ceremonial spaces. Grave goods from this era show a marked increase in La Tène-style weapons and ornaments, signaling the growing importance of displaying cultural refinement alongside warrior status. Even pottery, though simpler than continental counterparts, bore signs of the swirling patterns and curvilinear aesthetics. Religious life also absorbed La Tène sensibilities. Sacred objects, altars, votive offerings, ceremonial swords began to reflect the same stylized motifs seen in secular life. In this way, La Tène didn't just beautify the material world, it permeated the spiritual one as well. Gods were envisioned wearing torques and wielding La Tène weaponry. Priests and druids likely used tools and symbols crafted in this style, blending artistic identity with divine authority. Burial practices of the Latin period further reflect its cultural richness. Elite graves were filled with goods that highlighted both status and taste. Chariots complete with ornate wheels and fittings were buried alongside their noble owners. Warriors lay with weapons gleaming with inlay and filigree. Women often holding high social or spiritual status were buried with jewelry mirrors and elaborate clothing fasteners. These tombs were not just final resting places, they were cultural statements communicating values and power to the living as much as to the dead. Despite its widespread influence, Latin was never a single political entity. It had no capital, no emperor, no common law. What bound it together was shared language, aesthetics, and values. In that way, it stands as a testament to the power of culture without empire, a reminder that identity and unity can emerge through beauty, story, and belief rather than through conquest and law. Even today, Latin remains one of the most iconic artistic traditions in European history. Its visual language has influenced everything from medieval manuscript illumination to modern Celtic revival art. The swirling knots, the stylized animals, the ceremonial blades they speak across time, whispering of a people who saw the world not in straight lines and corners, but in circles, waves, and eternal returns. Latin was more than an art style. It was a mirror of the Celtic soul, restless, reverent, fearless, and always reaching for beauty, even in war and death. It was a golden age, not because it built empires, but because it built meaning and left behind a legacy written in bronze and gold. Iron Age. Britain was divided into tribal fortresses and alliances as Latin culture spread its artistic influence across Europe. Iron Age Britain began to take on a character all its own, fragmented, fortified, and fiercely tribal. Rather than forming a unified kingdom or centralized state, the landscape of Britain during this era resembled a mosaic of independent polities, each ruled by its own chieftain or noble family. These tribes, bound by blood custom and territory, carved their identities into hillsides and rivers, erecting fortresses on high ground and forging alliances or rivalries that shaped generations of power struggles. The hallmark of this fragmented world was the hill fort. Dotting the British countryside, from southern England to the Scottish lowlands, these elevated strongholds served as both military bastions and community centers. Constructed with concentric earthworks, timber palisades, and deep ditches, hill forts were strategically placed for maximum visibility and defense. They housed not only warriors and leaders, but also artisans, farmers, and priests, creating enclosed worlds that reflected the tribal hierarchy. At times of war, they were citadels. At times of peace, they became political courts, trading hubs, and ritual spaces. These fortresses were far from uniform. Some, like Maiden Castle in Dorset or Danebury in Hampshire, covered vast areas and featured complex defensive systems. Others were smaller, more localized centers of authority. Their diversity reflected the localized nature of tribal life in Iron Age Britain. Each tribe governed its own land customs and loyalties. Yet there was also a shared understanding of social roles, a warrior elite, a class of druids or advisors, and a large base of subsistence farmers and laborers who made up the majority. Tribal names from Roman sources give us a glimpse into the political map of the period. The Cativelloni Trinovantes. Iceni, Dobuni, Brigantes, and Dumnonii were just a few of the major groups identified in the southern and central parts of the island. In the north, the fierce Caledones and Votadini held sway over the highlands and coastlines. Each tribe had its own internal structure, often led by a king or queen, and maintained a council of nobles or elders. Decision-making was communal but hierarchical, and leadership depended as much on personal honor and alliance building as it did on bloodline. Despite this decentralization, tribes did not exist in isolation. Diplomatic marriages, shared ancestry, and seasonal festivals created a dynamic web of relationships. Allies were courted and enemies remembered across generations. Conflicts over grazing land-water access or trading rights could erupt into full-blown warfare, but just as often, diplomacy and intermarriage forged temporary peace. Chiefs would offer daughters in marriage to secure truces, host ritual feasts to affirm unity, or exchange lavish gifts to display mutual respect. These interactions weren't merely political, they were performative. Feasts served as arenas of status where the generosity of a host could elevate their standing. Gift exchanges often included valuable goods, such as decorated swords, torques, or livestock, with each item carrying not just economic value, but symbolic weight. To refuse a gift, or to fail to reciprocate, was to insult a tribe's honor. In such a world, reputation was everything, and intertribal relations were as much about theater and prestige as they were about practical alliance. Despite their differences, many of these tribes shared a common spiritual and legal framework. Druids, who were highly respected across Celtic society, often mediated disputes between tribes. They functioned as judges, healers, and keepers of oral history, their authority transcending tribal boundaries. A druid's ruling might settle a blood feud, bless a political alliance, or consecrate a battlefield. In times of great tribal gatherings, whether for religious festivals or strategic councils, druids could wield immense influence guiding decisions with wisdom accumulated through decades of memorized law myth and tradition. The economic structure of Iron Age Britain was deeply intertwined with this tribal landscape. Most people lived in small, scattered farming communities, cultivating barley, wheat, and legumes, raising cattle, pigs, and sheep, and crafting tools and textiles for domestic use. Trade was common, both within and between tribal zones. Salt, tin, iron, and grain were all exchanged along rivers and across hills. Tribes near the coast also participated in maritime trade, exchanging goods with continental Europe, particularly Gaul, and receiving luxury imports like Mediterranean wine glassware and Roman trinkets. Currency during this period was limited but evolving. Some tribes, such as the Trinovantes and Atrebates, began minting coins, typically gold or bronze discs, stamped with stylized designs of horses, warriors, or abstract patterns. These coins were used not for daily transactions, but for elite gift-giving and political symbolism. Possessing coins marked a tribe as wealthy and worldly, signaling participation in wider networks of trade and influence. Yet the tribal world was not static. The late Iron Age, especially in the decades before Rome's eventual conquest, saw the rise of larger and more politically dominant tribes, particularly in southeastern Britain. The Cativelloni, for example, expanded their territory aggressively, subsuming smaller groups and consolidating power. Their leaders styled themselves as kings of kings, ruling from fortified centers like Verulamium and Camulodunum. This trend toward consolidation mirrored broader shifts in Celtic Europe, where once equal tribes were beginning to form proto-states in response to internal pressures and external threats. These changes also created tensions. Some tribes sought to maintain their independence and traditional systems, resisting the growing power of regional hegemons. Others aligned themselves with foreign powers, especially Rome, in hopes of protection or economic gain. Tribal diplomacy with the Roman Republic intensified as Roman traders, envoys, and military advisors began appearing more frequently in British ports and hill forts. Chieftains weighed alliances carefully, knowing that proximity to Rome could bring wealth or ruin. In this increasingly interconnected world, tribal identity remained paramount. A person's loyalty was to kin and clan before any notion of national unity. The tribe was the unit of survival memory and meaning. From their fortified hilltops, Britons viewed the land not as a single country, but as a living patchwork of sacred spaces. Ancestral claims and territorial boundaries carved through both tradition and blood. When the Roman legions finally crossed the Channel, they did not meet a single opponent. They encountered dozens of fiercely independent nations, each with its own leaders, alliances, and ambitions. Some would resist, some would collaborate, but all would be drawn into the storm that would redefine the island forever. The Celts practiced ritual warfare with war cries and chariots. To the ancient Celts, warfare was never just a matter of bloodshed. It was a performance, a sacred act, and a test of both personal valor and tribal honor. Battles among Celtic tribes, and later against external enemies, were steeped in ritual symbolism and spectacle. Warfare in Iron Age. Britain was loud, chaotic, and deeply theatrical, designed to both terrify the enemy and affirm the warrior's status within their own society. This was not only about winning, it was about proving worth, pleasing the gods, and maintaining balance in the world. When Celtic warriors prepared for battle, they did not quietly assemble in disciplined silence. Instead, they erupted into the battlefield with a terrifying display of sound and motion. War cries, deep guttural roars, and chants echoed across the hills. Trumpets shaped like boar snouts or curved animal horns bellowed in unnatural tones meant to unnerve their opponents. Some sources even describe how warriors would sing or recite ancestral lineages as they charged, invoking the spirits of their forebears and calling on the gods for strength. This wasn't random noise. It was part of a deliberate psychological strategy. By creating a wall of sound, the Celts aimed to strike fear into their foes before swords were even drawn. Roman soldiers, despite their rigid training, frequently remarked on the unnerving effect of these tactics. The Celts wanted their enemies to see chaos, hear madness, and feel like they were up against something more elemental than human. Every sound, every movement was designed to overwhelm the senses. Visually, the battlefield was just as striking. Many Celtic warriors fought either partially or entirely naked, wearing nothing but jewelry or body paint made from woad, a plant that stained the skin a vivid blue. This wasn't just for intimidation. It was a spiritual act. By stripping down, warriors symbolically offered themselves to the gods, showing that they feared no death. The blue paint was thought to offer magical protection and connect the warrior to divine forces. Some even tattooed themselves with sacred symbols or animal motifs believed to channel spiritual power. Weapons were as much ritual objects as tools of war. Swords were long, slightly curved, and built more for slashing than stabbing. They were often adorned with swirling patterns and animal designs. Shields were large and oval, with central bosses that could be used to punch or deflect. Many shields were painted or carved with tribal emblems or sacred motifs, transforming them into extensions of the warrior's identity. The most elite fighters carried weapons that had been blessed or consecrated, their blades bearing marks of divine favor. But the most iconic element of Celtic warfare in Britain was the war chariot. While chariots had vanished from most continental battlefields by the time of the Roman Republic, they remained a distinctive and persistent feature of British warfare. These sleek two-wheeled vehicles were pulled by pairs of ponies and manned by a driver and a warrior. The chariots were not used to smash into enemy lines like later cavalry charges. Instead, they served as highly mobile platforms for hit-and-run attacks, missile throwing, and dramatic dueling. As a chariot sped toward the enemy line, the warrior would hurl javelins or sling stones, then leap off to engage in single combat before retreating swiftly to the vehicle and riding to safety. This fluid style of warfare was not only effective, it was symbolic. Chariots were associated with nobility, divine favor, and martial glory. Heroes of Celtic myth often ride into battle in chariots, their wheels kicking up divine sparks as they charge across the earth. To fight from a chariot was to become part of that mythic tradition. Ritual was embedded into the act of war itself. Before battle, druids or priests might perform sacrifices to invoke blessings or determine omens. The entrails of animals, or in some cases, human captives, were read to predict outcomes. Warriors might fast before a campaign or undergo purification rites. Specific gods were invoked for victory, especially Tutatis, the tribal protector, or Taranis, the thunder god. War was never seen as mere politics. By other means, it was a cosmic drama, with the outcome reflecting divine will. Celtic warriors also believed in fate and personal destiny. Dying in battle was not considered failure, it was transcendence. A warrior who died with bravery entered the otherworld, where feasting song and eternal honor awaited. This belief made Celtic armies incredibly resilient, as individuals fought with the certainty that death was not the end, but a transformation. They did not fear death. They welcomed the chance to prove their worth before gods and men. Warfare also served a social function within Celtic communities. Young men were expected to prove themselves in combat before gaining full status. Duels and skirmishes were common ways for aspiring warriors to win fame. Feats of valor were recorded in oral tradition and celebrated at feasts where bards would recite the names and deeds of the brave. Success in war elevated a family's honor, secured marriage alliances, and strengthened a tribe's prestige. The battlefield was where reputations were forged and legends born. While brutal, this form of warfare was not without its own codes. Single combat between champions was often used to decide the outcome of disputes without full-scale bloodshed. Honor-bound truces were respected, and warriors who broke oaths or fled battle were publicly shamed. Weapons taken from fallen enemies were often ritually bent or buried, signaling respect for the fallen and appeasement of the gods. Warfare was cruel, but never meaningless. Every blow had cultural weight. The arrival of the Romans would challenge this ritualized style of combat. The Celts' individual valor often clashed with Roman discipline. Their dramatic charges were answered by phalanx formations and drilled formations. Yet for all their organization, the Romans could not deny the sheer ferocity and spirit of their opponents. Even in defeat, Celtic warriors became legendary symbols of resistance and untamed freedom. The war cries of the Celts may no longer echo across Britain's hills, but their spirit lives on in tales of bold defiance, in the ancestral pride of their descendants, and in the memory of a people who made even war into a sacred roaring dance beneath the open sky. Women held notable roles of leadership in Celtic tribal society. In many ancient civilizations, women were confined to the margins of political life, excluded from councils, forbidden from fighting, and valued primarily for their roles within the home. But in Celtic tribal society, the picture was far more complex and often surprising. While patriarchy certainly existed, women in Celtic Britain and across the broader Celtic world occupied a spectrum of roles far beyond domestic boundaries. They were queens, warriors, judges, druids, landowners, and diplomats, figures of power who shaped the destinies of tribes and nations. Their presence and leadership was not only accepted, but sometimes revered. Roman historians, often shocked by the social norms they encountered in Britain and Gaul, frequently remarked on the influence and visibility of Celtic women. Tacitus, writing about his father-in-law's military campaigns in Britain, famously noted that the Britons make no distinction of gender among their leaders. This was not mere poetic exaggeration. Archaeological and literary evidence supports the idea that while male chieftains were common, leadership by women was not considered unusual or illegitimate. In fact, it often carried deep spiritual and ancestral significance. One of the most iconic examples of female leadership in Celtic Britain is Queen Boudica of the Iceni. Following the death of her husband, King Prasutagus, and the brutal abuse of her family by Roman officials, Boudica rose to lead a massive rebellion against Roman occupation in 62-61 CE. Her campaign devastated Roman settlements, including Camulodunum, Colchester, and Londinium, London, and for a time threatened the very foundation of Rome's presence in Britain. Though ultimately defeated, Boudica's courage and resolve left an indelible mark, not only as a symbol of resistance, but as a testament to the legitimate power of women in Celtic political life. But Boudica was not an exception. She was part of a wider tradition. Across Celtic regions, royal genealogies include numerous female rulers and matriarchs. In pre-Roman Gaul, women like Cartimandua, Queen of the Brigantes, also wielded considerable influence. Cartimandua governed one of the largest tribes in northern Britain during the 1st century CE and maintained a politically savvy alliance with Rome. Her decision to hand over the rebel leader Caratacus to the Roman authorities was a pivotal moment in Britain's early imperial history, one that drew both admiration and condemnation. What made Celtic society distinct was not just that women could lead, but that the structure of law and custom often supported their agency. Inheritance laws, for example, allowed for property and leadership titles to pass through the female line. While male primogeniture was common, it was not exclusive. Women could inherit land-managed estates and issue legal judgments. In some tribes, matrilineal descent determined nobility and legitimacy, making women central to political continuity. Marriages were often arranged to secure tribal alliances, but women, especially of noble birth, retained significant influence over the terms and expectations of these unions. Celtic mythology also reinforces this elevated role. Many legendary figures like Macha Scathach and Medby Maeve are depicted not as background figures, but as sovereigns, war leaders, or mentors. Scathach, in particular, is portrayed in Irish legend as a warrior queen and trainer of heroes, including the famed Cú Chulainn. Her fortress is a place of both martial and spiritual instruction, and her teachings include both swordplay and prophecy. These characters were not symbolic placeholders. They reflected real ideals and cultural possibilities. Religion further expanded women's influence. Within the druidic class, there is evidence that women could serve as priestesses, seers, and healers. Although the druids were a predominantly male institution, at least according to Roman accounts, female spiritual figures held immense power in their own right. They presided over rituals, interpreted omens, and served as oracles. In some accounts, particularly in Gaul and Ireland, female religious orders lived in isolated sanctuaries or sacred islands, serving as keepers of divine knowledge and conducting rites that even warriors and kings deferred to. Even in warfare, women were not always relegated to the sidelines. Though not every tribe permitted women in combat, accounts from classical writers describe female warriors fighting alongside men in times of great need. They wielded swords, rode chariots, and defended their homelands with ferocity. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by Roman authors, keen to dramatize the savagery of their enemies, or rooted in observed reality, they speak to the impression left by Celtic women on outsiders accustomed to more rigid gender norms. Daily life in tribal communities also reflected this broader agency. Women managed households, yes, but households in Iron Age Britain were productive economic units, not passive domestic spaces. Women spun textiles, brewed ale, oversaw crop storage, and supervised livestock. Many controlled key aspects of the economy and participated in trade, especially in coastal and riverside settlements. Their knowledge of land management, herbal medicine, and food preservation made them essential to the survival and stability of the tribe. Marriage and personal relationships in Celtic society offered another glimpse into gender dynamics. While arranged marriages were common evidence from later legal traditions, especially in Irish Brecon law, shows that women had rights to divorce, property division, and legal protection. Adultery, abuse, or failure to provide support could all be grounds for ending a union. In some cases, women even retained their own wealth after marriage, suggesting a level of financial independence uncommon in much of ancient Europe. Of course, Celtic society was not utopian. Power was still concentrated among elites, and not every woman had the same opportunities. Gender expectations did exist, and women's roles were shaped by class, tribe, and circumstance. Yet compared to contemporary Greek, Roman, or Near Eastern cultures, Celtic women in Britain lived in a world where their voice could be heard, their leadership respected, and their wisdom sought. This tradition of female strength and agency has left a long cultural shadow. The stories of warrior queens, wise priestesses, and daring mothers did not fade with the arrival of Rome. They were passed down in poems, in oral tales, and in the hearts of communities who remembered what it meant to live in a society where women could lead from the front. These echoes survive in legend, in language, and in the pride of descendants who still look to the past for examples of balance, resilience, and courage. Druidic orders preserved knowledge, law, healing, and divination. In the spiritual and intellectual heart of ancient Celtic society stood the Druids, keepers of memory, interpreters of divine will, and guardians of law and tradition. While warriors defended the tribe and chieftains ruled its affairs, it was the Druids who preserved the knowledge that bound a people together across generations. Their influence extended far beyond the sacred grove. They were the philosophers, scientists, judges, and historians of their world. In a society without writing, their minds were the libraries, and within those libraries were the threads that held the Celtic world intact. The Druids were more than priests. They formed a complex and highly respected class within Celtic society, often divided into specialized roles. Some focused on spiritual rites and sacrificial ceremonies. Others served as healers, versed in herbal medicine and natural remedies. Still others functioned as legal arbiters, mediating disputes within and between tribes. They were not confined to temples. There were none. The landscape itself was their sanctuary. Sacred groves, rivers, and mountaintops became their places of communion with the divine. Perhaps their most astonishing trait was their intellectual discipline. According to Roman sources, the training of a druid could take as long as 20 years. All knowledge was committed to memory. Writing was avoided not because of illiteracy, but by principle. They believed that the power of the spoken word, oral tradition, was sacred, and that writing weakened memory and diluted the spiritual force of language. This belief helped preserve vast bodies of knowledge across generations. Mythologies, genealogies, cosmologies, legal codes, and rituals were all transmitted orally in meticulous detail. The educational process of a druid likely began in childhood. Initiates were trained in layers of lore, starting with the basic elements of tribal law and moving through poetry, healing, astronomy, and esoteric philosophy. Memorization techniques were refined into an art form. Complex mnemonic devices, rhythmic verse, and seasonal recitations allowed students to retain vast quantities of information. By the time one was declared a full druid, they were not only a religious figure, but a living vessel of cultural identity. In law, druids held unparalleled authority. In a world where most disputes arose over land honor or inheritance, their rulings shaped tribal cohesion and moral order. They issued judgments in accordance with customary codes, long-established principles based on precedent, ritual, and consensus. Their authority could cross tribal lines, allowing them to mediate conflicts that otherwise might spark bloodshed. To go against a druid's ruling was to risk not only social exclusion, but spiritual condemnation. Their role as healers was equally vital. With no formal medical institutions, druids were the primary source of both preventative care and emergency treatment. Their understanding of plants, minerals, and the human body was remarkably advanced for the time. They prescribed herbal infusions, used salves and poultices, and applied ritual techniques to aid recovery. Healing was not purely physical. It was holistic, involving prayers, chants, and symbolic acts meant to realign the patient's spirit with the harmony of the natural world. Divination formed one of the more mysterious and feared aspects of their practice. Through omens, dreams, weather patterns, the flight of birds, or the behavior of animals, druids interpreted the will of the gods. Some practices were highly ritualized, involving animal entrails, sacred fires, or trance states. These readings shaped major decisions, whether to go to war, when to harvest, which alliances to pursue, or how to respond to disasters. Chieftains often sought their guidance before any significant action. In many ways, druids were the moral compass and strategic advisors of Celtic leadership. The power of the druids alarmed Rome. To the pragmatic and bureaucratic mind of the empire, a non-literate priestly class that resisted assimilation and operated independently of formal kingship posed a significant threat. Roman writers like Julius Caesar both admired and feared the druids. In his Commentary de Bello Gallico, Caesar described the druids of Gaul as the unifying force among otherwise fractious tribes. He noted that they held annual councils in sacred spaces where leaders deferred to their authority. This power, spiritual and political, was precisely why the Romans sought to destroy them. In Britain, that destruction reached a climax on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, a renowned stronghold of Druidic tradition. In 60 CE, the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paullinus led a brutal campaign to eradicate the Druids. As his legions crossed onto the island, they were met not with warriors, but with chanting priests and shrieking priestesses who invoked curses and wielded torches. The Roman soldiers, despite their training, hesitated, paralyzed by what they perceived as dark magic. But Paulinus pressed on. The groves were cut down, the altars burned. The last sanctuary of the Druids in Britain was silenced by steel and fire, yet the memory endured. Even after the Roman conquest, elements of Druidic tradition survived in the shadows, disguised in folk customs, preserved in oral tales, or absorbed into early Christian practices. The reverence for trees, wells, and sacred stones continued. Seasonal festivals like Samhain Beltane and Imbolc persisted, reinterpreted, but not forgotten. The Druid's voice still whispered through the land, even if the robe had been exchanged for the cloak of the wandering bard or the village wise woman. In later centuries, the idea of the Druid took on legendary status. Romanticized and mythologized, they became symbols of wisdom, magic, and national identity. In the Celtic revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries, they were reborn in poetry and pageantry. While the historical details may have blurred, the essence remained the Druid as guardian of memory, balance, and truth. In a world without books, the Druids kept the stories alive. In a world without written law, they enforced justice. In a world threatened by empires, they preserved identity. They were not merely figures of the past. They were the living bridge between the visible and invisible, between the tribe and the cosmos. And in that role, they shaped not only Celtic religion, but Celtic civilization itself. Caesar's campaigns began Rome's long and costly British invasion. In the year 55 BCE, the waves of the English Channel stirred with something new. Not just the winds of summer, but the ambition of an empire. Gaius Julius Caesar, fresh from years of bloodshed and triumph in Gaul, turned his eyes toward the misty forested island to the northwest. Britain had long existed on the edge of Roman awareness, rumored to be rich in metals and mystery, populated by painted warriors, and ruled by exotic customs. To Caesar, it offered more than geographic intrigue. It offered glory, legacy, and the chance to outshine his political rivals in Rome. With that in mind, he launched a military expedition that would become the first Roman incursion into the island, setting in motion a century-long struggle for dominance over the Celtic tribes of Britain. But Caesar's initial landing was anything but a conquest. What he encountered on the shores of Kent was resistance, ferocious mobile, and deeply unfamiliar to Roman tactics. Chariots raced along the beach, javelins rained from the cliffs, and the legions found themselves chest-deep in water, struggling to reach dry land under a hail of missiles. The Britons, unlike their continental cousins, had held on to the chariot as a core instrument of warfare, and they used it with deadly skill. The result was a chaotic battle that tested Roman discipline like few others. Caesar, never one to retreat without ceremony, managed to establish a beachhead and accept the nominal surrender of a few tribal leaders. Yet the reality was clear. He had not conquered Britain. He had merely touched its edge. With supplies running low and storms battering his fleet, he withdrew across the channel. The invasion had proven costly and inconclusive. Still, Caesar was not finished. He returned the following year, this time with a larger force and better logistical planning. The second campaign made deeper incursions inland, and again some tribal chieftains submitted, offering hostages in exchange for peace. But once again, no permanent gains were made. The Romans faced stiff resistance, logistical nightmares, and unfamiliar terrain. Caesar eventually left the island, never to return. His ambitions redirected back toward Rome's turbulent politics. Although these campaigns failed to establish lasting Roman presence in Britain, they were monumental in shaping the narrative of conquest. In Roman eyes, Caesar had dared to step beyond the known world into a land of spirit's fog and myth. He brought back stories, prisoners, and intelligence, laying the groundwork for future ambitions, and he had made a political statement to the Senate and the people of Rome that Britain was not beyond the reach of Roman power. For the Britons, Caesar's visits were more than military clashes. They were cultural tremors. They revealed the vulnerability of the coastline, the limits of tribal independence, and the looming reality of a force far more organized, disciplined, and patient than anything they had encountered before. Some tribes began to forge closer ties with Roman trade networks. Others prepared for future conflict. The diplomatic landscape began to shift as client relationships with Rome became a political tool among competing chieftains. Indeed, Caesar's departure did not mean Rome's retreat. In the decades that followed, Roman influence continued to seep into Britain through trade diplomacy and strategic alliances. Imported goods, wine pottery coins began to appear more frequently in elite burial sites. British tribes in the southeast, especially those closest to Gaul, began minting their own coins modeled after Roman examples. Local leaders sought Roman support against their rivals, setting up client relationships that blurred the line between independence and subjugation. This period also saw growing Roman knowledge of the island's geography, politics, and tribal divisions. Through envoys and merchants, Rome learned about the major powers like the Catuvellani and the Trinovantes, their internal rivalries, and the potential for exploitation. While Caesar had come with legions, future Roman leaders would use subtler weapons, influence treaties, and economic dependence. But the dream of full conquest did not die with Caesar. It merely slept. A century later, under Emperor Claudius, that dream would awaken with renewed force. In 43 CE, 4 Roman legions landed on British shores, not as an exploratory raid, but as a full-scale invasion. This time, the empire came to stay. The war that followed would be long and brutal as Rome slowly pushed inland, fortifying roads, building cities, and eroding the independence of tribe after tribe. But it all began with Caesar standing on the deck of his ship, staring at the fog-shrouded island that beckoned just beyond the waves. His campaigns, though limited in military success, were monumental in their symbolic impact. They marked the beginning of Rome's obsession with Britain, an obsession driven by myth, resource hunger, and political calculation. They revealed the tenacity and strength of the Celtic Britons who would resist for generations, sometimes winning, often losing, but never fully submitting in spirit. And they reminded Rome that the edge of the known world was not empty. It was inhabited by peoples who would not yield quietly to the march of empire. Today, when we speak of the Roman conquest of Britain, we often start with Claudius or Agricola, but the true beginning lies in Caesar's bold, uncertain foray into a land of painted warriors standing firm on the shores with their chariots and war cries, daring the empire to try again. And it would. Rome met fierce resistance from native kings and mobile warbands. When the Roman Empire finally launched its full invasion of Britain in 43 CE, it did not find a fractured, frightened island waiting for conquest. It found defiance. Across the hills and forests, behind the ramparts of hill forts and the smoke of tribal hearths, resistance was brewing. Native kings, seasoned war bands, and proud lineages rose to meet the most disciplined military force the world had ever known. The Roman legions, armed with superior engineering and tactics, expected swift domination. What they encountered instead was a relentless and deeply personal war, fought not just to protect land, but to preserve identity. The early years of Rome's conquest were marked by dramatic campaigns and even more dramatic opposition. Among the first and most notable figures of resistance was Caradicus, a chieftain of the Catuvellauni tribe. Following Rome's invasion, he became a symbol of defiance in southern Britain, rallying allied tribes and orchestrating a campaign of mobile warfare designed to harass, delay, and destabilize the advancing Romans. He avoided direct confrontation with the legion's full strength, instead striking quickly with small war bands disappearing into the countryside before the heavy Roman infantry could respond. Caradicus's mastery of guerrilla tactics made him a thorn in the side of Roman governors for nearly a decade. His forces leveraged terrain, using forests, marshes, and mountains as both shield and sword. Roman roads, the arteries of their military dominance, were not yet fully constructed, forcing the legions to fight on ground that favored their enemies. Ambushes were common, and Roman forts were constantly under threat from sudden raids. Every village burned by Rome brought more warriors to Caradicus's cause. He became more than a military leader. He became a living symbol of native resistance. His campaign eventually led him westward into the rugged highlands of Wales, where he allied with the fierce Silures and Ordovician tribes, whose warrior culture and natural environment made them especially difficult to subdue. In one of his most famous stands, Caradicus positioned his forces atop a steep hill behind riverbanks and stone fortifications, daring the Romans to attack. Though ultimately defeated in that battle, his reputation was only enhanced. Captured and brought to Rome in chains, he delivered a speech before the Senate so eloquent that the Emperor Claudius pardoned him, a rare gesture of respect for a man who had so long defied imperial power. But Caradicus was only the beginning. Resistance continued to erupt across Britain in different forms, driven by both politics and passion. One of the largest uprisings occurred just 2 decades later, in 60 CE, when Queen Boudicca of the Iceni led a massive revolt that nearly shattered Roman control in the southeast. Furious at Roman abuses, including the flogging of her and the violation of her daughters, Boudicca united several tribes and descended upon Roman settlements with catastrophic force. Cities such as Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium were burned to the ground. Tens of thousands were killed. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, barely managed to regroup and counter her advance in a final, decisive battle. Boudicca's uprising demonstrated the depth of native fury and the organizational capability of tribal Britain. It was not merely an explosion of anger, it was a coordinated campaign led by a charismatic and capable leader, fighting for dignity, autonomy, and vengeance. The rebellion, though crushed, shook Rome to its core. For a moment, the dream of permanent conquest teetered on the edge of collapse. The resistance was not only driven by large-scale revolts. Across Britain, mobile war bands, fast-moving groups of warriors, often mounted or chariot-bound, continued to challenge Roman authority through raids, ambushes, and sabotage. These war bands, typically composed of young fighters under the command of a noble or elite warrior, were the backbone of tribal defense. Lightly armored and highly mobile, they could appear without warning and vanish before a Roman patrol could respond. They struck supply lines, attacked forts, and terrorized collaborators. Their impact was psychological, as much as tactical. They reminded everyone, Roman or Briton, that the land was not yet tamed. What made these warbands so effective was their knowledge of terrain and their decentralized structure. They did not require massive logistical support or long campaigns. They lived off the land and struck at will. They also maintained spiritual motivation. Many warriors believed they were serving not just their tribe, but their gods. Some wore war paint and sacred charms into battle. Others invoked ancestral spirits before a raid. Warfare for them was as much a sacred duty as a strategic decision. Rome responded with its own tactics, building roads to increase troop mobility, constructing fortified camps across key territories, and launching punitive campaigns into rebel strongholds. They relied on allied tribes and defectors for intelligence, and began integrating some Britons into the imperial system as auxiliary troops or client kings. The strategy was slow, but methodical. Choke resistance with infrastructure, isolate rebellious areas, and co-opt the local elite. And yet resistance never fully vanished. In the north, especially beyond the eventual line of Hadrian's Wall, tribal defiance remained strong. The Caledones and other highland tribes never submitted, continuing to raid Roman territory for centuries. Their mountainous terrain, unpredictable weather, and fierce independence made northern Britain the empire's perpetual frontier, always unstable, always demanding garrisons and vigilance. Even when Rome erected fortifications like the Antonine Wall further north, they proved temporary. Resistance simply adapted and returned. The cost of these rebellions and skirmishes was immense. Rome spent enormous resources to maintain order in Britain, resources that could have been deployed elsewhere in the empire. Legions were tied down for decades, governors replaced amid political fallout, and confidence in Roman dominance regularly tested. The conquest of Britain, rather than a swift expansion, became one of Rome's most protracted and costly imperial undertakings. And for all of this, the spirit of native resistance endured. It lived in the whispered legends of heroes like Caradocus and Boudica. It marched in the footsteps of warbands who defied imperial legions with nothing but speed, cunning, and iron resolve. It flowed through the songs of bards, the rituals of hidden druids, and the gaze of warriors who refused to kneel. Rome may have conquered much of Britain by the sword, but it never fully claimed the soul of its people. That defiance, shaped by land lineage and legacy, would carry on, echoing through centuries of struggle and forming the bedrock of a cultural identity that no empire could erase. Claudius launched a full conquest and reshaped Celtic political rule. In the year 43 CE, the Roman Empire, now under the rule of Emperor Claudius, set its sights once again on Britain. Unlike Julius Caesar's earlier expeditions, Claudius's campaign was not exploratory, symbolic, or politically performative. It was a deliberate, full-scale military invasion, complete with 4 legions, auxiliaries, cavalry engineers, and a clear imperial directive. Britain was to be brought into the Roman world not as a temporary conquest, but as a lasting province. It marked a turning point in the island's history, one that would permanently alter the political and cultural landscape of the Celtic tribes. At the time, Claudius was an unlikely emperor. Seen as weak and physically frail, he was eager to assert his authority and prove his legitimacy to the Senate, the army, and the Roman populace. A successful military campaign, especially one in the mysterious and unconquered lands across the Channel, offered a perfect opportunity. But Claudius did not personally lead the initial invasion. That responsibility fell to Aulus Plautius, a competent general who marshaled nearly 40,000 troops and crossed into southeastern Britain to begin the assault. The Roman forces met stiff resistance. The native tribes, led by the Catuvellani, under the command of Caradocus and his brother Togodumnus, were formidable opponents. The Catuvellani had grown into one of the most powerful tribal confederations in Britain and saw Roman intrusion as an existential threat. Initial clashes along the River Medway and further inland demonstrated both the strength and courage of the Britons and the ruthless efficiency of the Roman legions. Yet despite the bravery of the defenders, the tide of Roman discipline, technology, and military organization was unstoppable. After key victories, Aulus Plautius sent for Emperor Claudius to complete the symbolic final stage of the campaign. Claudius arrived with pomp and ceremony, bringing with him war elephants, likely the first such beasts the Britons had ever seen. He entered the captured tribal capital of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, received the submission of 11 tribal kings, and declared Britain officially under Roman control. It was more than a military triumph. It was a public relations victory that Claudius used to secure his status back in Rome. He returned to the capital to a hero's welcome and a grand triumphal parade. But conquest was only the beginning. With Roman rule established in the southeast, the real work began, integrating the Celtic tribes into the imperial system. Claudius and his successors understood that Rome could not rule by force alone. They needed to reshape the political fabric of Britain, to turn warrior chiefs into Roman allies, tribal territories into Romanized districts, and cultural pride into imperial loyalty. To accomplish this, Rome adopted a strategy of co-optation. Many local rulers who submitted to Rome were allowed to retain their status as client kings. They kept their lands, titles, and internal authority so long as they pledged loyalty to the emperor, paid tribute, and kept order. In exchange, they received Roman citizenship, Roman-style infrastructure, and access to trade networks that brought Mediterranean goods into their territories. These client kings became the first agents of Romanization, dressed in togas minting coins with Latin inscriptions and building villas in the Roman style. Camulodunum was transformed into a Roman colonia, a settlement for retired legionaries and a model of Roman urban life. Temples, forums, theaters, and bathhouses sprang up where once stood wooden longhouses and tribal shrines. Roman roads were carved through forests and hills connecting garrisons and markets. Forts became towns, and towns became centers of administration. The very landscape began to speak Latin. But while some tribes adjusted, others refused. Resistance continued, especially in the west and north. Rome responded with military campaigns that crushed uprisings and forcibly annexed rebellious territories. Chieftains who refused Roman protection were deposed or killed, their lands given to loyalists or Roman settlers. Over time, the patchwork of Celtic political autonomy was replaced with a rigid provincial structure. Tribal borders were redefined, traditional power hierarchies dismantled, and Rome imposed its own governors, tax collectors, and legal codes. One of the most significant changes was the erosion of the Druidic order. Recognizing the Druid's central role in maintaining tribal identity and spiritual cohesion, Roman officials targeted them as political threats. Their sacred groves were cut down, their schools disbanded, their authority outlawed. In some regions, resistance by Druids sparked brutal retaliations, including the infamous massacre on the island of Mona Anglesey, which marked the violent end of organized Druidic resistance in Britain. Despite these measures, Romanization was uneven. In the southeast near the coast and along major roads, Roman culture took hold quickly. Towns like Londinium, Verulamium, and Caleva became vibrant centers of Roman British life. Local elites sent their sons to study in Latin, adopted Roman law, and styled themselves as miniature senators. Yet in the more remote and mountainous regions of Wales, the Pennines, and the Scottish borders, the changes were superficial. Tribal customs endured. The old gods were still honored, and beneath the Roman veneer, Celtic identity remained strong. For some Britons, Roman rule brought undeniable benefits: increased trade, improved infrastructure, greater personal wealth, and access to imperial protection. For others, it meant cultural displacement, heavy taxation, and the loss of ancestral lands. The transformation of Celtic political rule under Claudius was thus not a simple matter of domination. It was a complex process of negotiation, coercion, and adaptation. By reshaping the power dynamics of Britain, elevating collaborators, and crushing dissent, Claudius laid the foundation for nearly 4 centuries of Roman occupation. But the tribal spirit of the Celts did not vanish. It adapted, survived, and in many cases went underground. For while the empire might claim the land, the people remained rooted in memories that reached far deeper than Rome's ambitions. Some tribes allied with Rome, others resisted with guerrilla warfare. The Roman conquest of Britain did not unfold along a single unified path. It was a mosaic of contradictory responses. Some tribes chose to ally seeking advantage under imperial rule, while others mounted tenacious resistance, launching relentless guerrilla campaigns from the highlands and hinterlands. This duality, cooperation and defiance, would define the Roman experience in Britain for centuries as imperial expansion collided with tribal loyalties, ancestral land claims, and cultural survival. In the southeast, where the initial Roman landings occurred, some tribes quickly aligned themselves with the invaders. For the Atrebates and the Trinovantes, both of whom had suffered under the expanding dominance of more powerful neighbors like the Catuvellani Roman rule, offered an opportunity to reverse their fortunes. These tribes became early Roman allies, offering tribute intelligence and auxiliary troops in exchange for protection and imperial favor. Their leaders were recognized as client kings, allowed to govern under the aegis of Rome, their status reinforced by official titles and access to Roman wealth. Such alliances brought visible transformation. In these regions, Roman architecture, coinage, and clothing quickly took root. Towns were laid out in grid patterns, complete with bathhouses, amphitheaters, and temples. Local elites adopted Latin names, spoke the language of empire, and sent their children to be educated in Roman customs. Through cooperation, they preserved a measure of autonomy, albeit one that was always contingent on imperial approval. But beyond the reach of Roman roads in the hills of Wales, the moors of the north, and the crags of western Britain, other tribes chose a different path. For them, alliance with Rome meant submission, and that was unthinkable. Tribes like the Silures and the Ordovicas responded to the Roman presence not with treaties, but with ambushes. Their war bands struck from the shadows, harrying supply lines, attacking forts, and then vanishing into the wilderness. To the Romans, they were bandits. To their own people, they were defenders of freedom. Guerrilla warfare suited the geography of these tribes. The rugged terrain, steep hills, dense forests, and narrow passes was nearly impossible for organized Roman formations to navigate effectively. The Roman military machine, built for open field engagements and siege warfare, struggled against foes who refused to stand still. The guerrilla fighters avoided pitched battles. They favored speed, surprise, and deep knowledge of the land. They fought not to conquer Rome, but to make its rule unbearable. These tribes were also sustained by cultural pride. Their resistance was more than strategic, it was spiritual. The land was sacred, dotted with ancestral tombs and sacred groves. To abandon it to foreign rule was to betray generations of kin and the gods who protected them. Leaders of guerrilla bands often claimed divine sanction, conducting rites before battles and invoking the favor of tribal deities. For many, war was not merely survival, it was devotion. The Roman response to these campaigns was brutal and systematic. Governors like Sextus Julius Frontinus and Gnaeus Julius Agricola launched punitive expeditions into the mountains of Wales and the north. They built forts deep in enemy territory, constructed roads to penetrate the wild, and relocated rebellious populations. Entire villages were razed. Resistance leaders were hunted down. The druids, seen as the ideological backbone of rebellion, were targeted, their sacred sites destroyed. And yet, the resistance endured. Guerrilla warfare is a strategy of time and attrition. Even when Roman victories, mounted peace remained elusive. Forts had to be constantly garrisoned. Supply convoys needed escorts, and governors rotated frequently to manage the volatility. Every Roman advance into tribal lands required an investment of troops and treasure. The further they pushed, the more fragile their control became. Meanwhile, hybrid zones emerged, areas where Romanized elites ruled over largely traditional rural populations. In such regions, a complex dance played out. Local leaders wore togas in court, but spoke Brittonic at home. Roman gods stood alongside Celtic deities in shrines. Laws were issued in Latin, but interpreted through tribal customs. This blending, born of both cooperation and necessity, created a Romano-British culture that was neither fully Celtic nor fully Roman. Some tribes switched strategies over time. The Brigantes of northern England initially cooperated with Rome under their queen Cartimandua, who famously handed over the rebel leader Caradocus to the Romans. But her rule was unpopular, and when her ex-husband Venutius led a revolt, many Brigantes abandoned diplomacy in favor of armed rebellion. The shift cost them dearly, as Rome crushed the uprising and dismantled Brigantian independence. Their story became a cautionary tale of divided loyalties and the high price of resistance. Over time, Rome's presence grew heavier. Forts became permanent tax collection, more rigorous, and the demands of the empire more intrusive. Even tribes that once cooperated began to chafe under Roman expectations. Rebellions flared in areas once deemed pacified. Young warriors inspired by the tales of Caradocus and Boudica took up arms in secret. Guerrilla war became a tradition passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. Not always as open rebellion, but as a simmering refusal to fully surrender. This patchwork of cooperation and conflict defined Roman Britain. The empire never fully conquered the island it negotiated with. It fought against it, bribed it, and in many cases adapted to it. The tribes were never a single entity. They were individuals, clans, and nations, each with its own calculations and concerns. Some saw Rome as opportunity, others saw it as oppression, and many walked the line in between. In the end, the legacy of this divided response was not unity under Rome, but a layered identity, a people who could build Roman-style villas and still whisper prayers in the old tongue. The tribes that fought with Rome and those that fought against it were two sides of the same coin. Both contributed to the unique story of Britain, a land that even under foreign rule remained defiantly its own. Romanized cities rose, but traditional Celtic life endured in the West. As Roman legions carved roads through forests and rivers, a new kind of Britain began to rise. In the southeast and central lowlands, urban centers sprouted where tribal settlements once stood. Camulodunum, Colchester, Londinium. London, Verulamium, St. Albans, and Eboracum, York grew into bustling Romanized cities, their streets lined with villas, forums, baths, temples, and theaters. These cities symbolized Rome's ambition to transform Britain from a land of hill forts and war bands into a province indistinguishable from the rest of the empire. And in many places, the transformation took root, yet not everywhere. To the west, in the mountains of Wales, the rugged coasts of Cornwall, the mist-laden fens, and the more remote reaches of the north, traditional Celtic life persisted. Here, the Roman footprint was lighter, and the people held fast to the rhythms, rituals, and values of their ancestors. Even as Latin was spoken in city forums and Roman law echoed in new-built basilicas, the old languages whispered through hillsides carried by shepherds, chieftains, and druids who never fully yielded to foreign rule. The contrast was striking. In Romanized cities, life revolved around the imperial model. Streets followed grid patterns. Public baths offered hygiene and gossip. Amphitheaters hosted gladiatorial games and wild beast shows. Temples dedicated to Jupiter Mars and the emperor himself coexisted with shrines to local gods. Latin inscriptions marked milestones and grave markers. Education followed Roman curriculum teaching rhetoric logic, and imperial history to the sons of elite Romano-Britons. Trade thrived. Goods from Gaul, Hispania, and even the eastern Mediterranean found their way into the hands of British merchants. In these urban zones, Celtic identity was transformed rather than erased. Local elites, eager to maintain power, adopted Roman titles and customs. They lived in Roman-style villas, dined in the triclinium, and wore togas during official gatherings. Yet many still trace their lineage through tribal kinship, worshiped native deities alongside Roman ones, and spoke Brythonic in private settings. Identity became layered. One could be both a Roman citizen and a descendant of a warrior tribe, both a provincial official and a keeper of ancestral pride. Beyond the reach of urban centers, however, a different Britain endured. In the western hills and rural heartlands, roundhouses still dotted the landscape. Farming communities continued to cultivate barley and herd cattle as they had for generations. Festivals like Samhain Beltane and Imbolc were celebrated in the old ways, with fires, music, and rites of passage. Tribal elders held authority, and druidic knowledge lingered in oral traditions, even if no longer practiced openly. Life here moved at a different pace, not by imperial decree, but by the turning of the seasons and the cycles of the land. In these regions, Roman structures were rare. Few stone roads crossed the uplands. Military forts, if present at all, were outposts rather than centers of administration. Trade existed, but on a smaller scale, more barter than coin. Roman goods might be seen in the possession of a local chieftain or noble, but they were exotic novelties, not necessities. Here, the empire felt distant. Its laws were less binding. Its taxes harder to enforce. Its culture more a rumor than a presence. Yet this was not mere stubbornness or isolation. It was resilience. The people of the West retained a way of life rooted in ancestry, myth, and community. Oral tradition remained the lifeblood of history and education. Stories of legendary ancestors, gods, and heroes were passed from one generation to the next, preserving Celtic identity even as Roman Britain evolved. Local dialects remained untouched by Latin influence. Children grew up knowing the names of sacred hills and ancient burial mounds, not the geography of the empire. This cultural endurance was often invisible to Roman eyes. To imperial administrators, the absence of revolt was equated with submission. But beneath the surface, an unbroken thread remained. In many of these Western communities, Rome was tolerated, not embraced. Officials might be obeyed, but they were not revered. Taxes might be paid, but not without resistance. And when the empire's grip began to loosen in the 4th and 5th centuries, it was in these places that the Old World emerged once more, not as a rebellion, but as a revival. Archaeological evidence supports this dichotomy. In Romanized towns, we find mosaics, hypocausts, and writing tablets. In the West, we find continuity, Iron Age pottery styles that persist well into the Roman period, hill forts that remained active gathering places, and burial customs unchanged for generations. Inscriptions disappear, but story survives. Cities rise and fall, but the language of the land continues. The endurance of Celtic life in the West also had long-term consequences. When the Roman Empire withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, it was not the cities that led the future. They often declined, abandoned, or repurposed. It was the tribal communities of the West, still rooted in older traditions, that adapted and reasserted themselves. From them would emerge the post-Roman kingdoms of Wales, Cornwall, and the Old North states that retained Brythonic languages, mythologies, and social structures long after the Roman eagle had flown away. Even today, the echo remains. In Wales, Cornwall, and parts of Western England and Scotland, the memory of those who resisted full assimilation lives on in language, legend, and landscape. Place names recall ancient roots. Folklore retains the cadence of old rituals. The West kept the flame of Celtic Britain alive when other regions succumbed to transformation. So, while Roman cities may have symbolized power, order, and progress to the empire, they were not the whole story. In the hills and valleys where Rome built little, the heart of Britain continued to beat to an older rhythm. A rhythm of kin, of land of gods, with antlers and stories in the wind. And though empires fall, such rhythms endure. As the empire fell, Celtic kingdoms rose from Roman Britain's ruins. When the Roman Empire finally loosened its grip on Britain in the early 5th century, it did not vanish with a single trumpet call or a decisive final march. The collapse came gradually, first as administrative neglect, then military withdrawal, and finally silence. Imperial legions sailed away. Governors stopped sending reports, and the flow of Roman coin and authority dried up. The cities that had once pulsed with the order of the empire began to decay, their stone walls no longer guarded their markets, fading into memory. But from the ruins of Rome's provincial framework, something ancient stirred, a resurgence of native identity, a reclamation of the land by those who had never fully let it go. From the ashes of empire, the Celtic kingdoms rose. These were not foreign foundations, but rebirths. Many of the new kingdoms that emerged: Gwynedd Powys Dyfed in Wales, Dumnonia in Cornwall, Strathclyde in the north, were built upon the bones of earlier tribal territories. Their boundaries often mirrored ancient kinship lines. Their leaders traced their lineage back not to Roman officials, but to Celtic chieftains, legendary ancestors, and semi-mythic warlords who had resisted Roman rule. While they inherited some aspects of Roman organization, fortified hilltops, roads, even elements of law, their core identity remained distinctly Celtic. Language was one of the most enduring inheritances. While Latin had become the language of governance in the cities, Brythonic dialects had never disappeared from the countryside. In the post-Roman age, they became dominant once again, flourishing in speech song and poetry. Welsh, Cornish, and the early forms of Cumbric and Breton all evolved from this linguistic resurgence. In these tongues, kings gave laws, bards preserved history, and druids transformed now into Christian priests. Or rural sages spoke wisdom passed down from pre-Roman times. With the decline of centralized Roman power, these rising kingdoms also reasserted traditional social structures. Kinship networks and tribal affiliations regained their primacy. The authority of a king or chieftain depended not on imperial appointment, but on the strength of his bloodline, the loyalty of his warriors, and the sacred power he was believed to channel. Courts were held in assembly fields or wooden halls. Justice was spoken aloud and remembered through oral tradition. Memory became law. Yet these were not static societies. The post-Roman Celtic kingdoms were dynamic, adapting old ways to new realities. Christianity, which had begun to spread during the final centuries of Roman rule, now flourished across the West. Missionaries like St. Patrick in Ireland, St. David in Wales, and others in the north helped weave Christian teachings into Celtic worldviews. Rather than erasing the always early Celtic Christianity, often absorbed them, preserving sacred wells, seasonal festivals, and even certain ritual practices within a Christian framework. Churches were built beside ancient groves. Saints replaced tribal gods as protectors of land and clan. The cultural output of this era was remarkable. Poets and storytellers known as bards became central figures in courtly life. They composed intricate praise poems, genealogies, and elegies, many of which survive today in early Welsh manuscripts like the Book of Taliesin. These works reveal a society steeped in heroic values, honor bravery, kin, loyalty, and the defense of land. Heroes like Urien of Reged, or the semi-legendary Arthur, whose roots may lie in a post-Roman warlord of the same name, were immortalized in verse, their deeds serving as both inspiration and instruction. Militarily, the Celtic kingdoms had no illusions of peace. As Rome receded, new threats rose. The Picts in the North Irish raiders from the west, and increasingly aggressive Germanic tribes from across the North Sea, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes pressed into the lands once guarded by the legions. In the east and south of Britain, these invaders began carving out their own kingdoms, establishing what would become the foundations of Anglo-Saxon England. In response, the Celtic realms of the west and north hardened. Hill forts were reoccupied. Warrior bands were rallied. The fight for survival land and sovereignty resumed, but now without the buffer of Rome. Despite frequent warfare, the Celtic kingdoms proved remarkably resilient. In Wales and the Cornish Peninsula, native dynasties held power for centuries. Strathclyde and the Cumbric-speaking kingdoms of the north maintained cultural distinctiveness deep into the Middle Ages. Brittany, settled by migrants from Britain, fleeing Anglo-Saxon expansion, preserved its Celtic tongue and traditions even across the sea in what is now France. These kingdoms did not merely survive, they carried the torch of Celtic identity forward into the medieval world. Their legacy is enduring. The cultural forms developed during this post-Roman period, heroic poetry, insular art styles, legal codes like the Welsh Cyfraith Hywel, would go on to shape the history of Britain and Europe. The Celtic revival movements of the 19th and 20th centuries found their foundation in this very era, drawing from its poetry, myths, and symbols. And even today, the political and cultural identities of regions like Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany are rooted in the memory of these first post-Roman kingdoms. In many ways, the fall of Rome did not signal the end of civilization. In Britain, it opened the door to a resurgence. Freed from the constraints of empire, the peoples of the West reasserted who they had always been. They spoke their languages, worshipped in their ways, ruled through ancestral law, and sang their stories into the hills and valleys. The empire had come and gone, but the Celts remained not as conquered subjects, but as sovereign nations, rising from the ruins, with memory as their shield and tradition as their guide. From the misty shores of the Atlantic to the highland fortresses of the north, the story of the Celtic Britons is not one of defeat, but of endurance. Empires rose and fell, armies marched and vanished, but the spirit of the Celts, rooted in land, language, and legacy, remained. Though the Romans left behind stone roads and silent ruins. It was the Celts who carried memory forward in stories, in song, and in the rhythms of a life untouched by imperial order. Even today, the echoes of their world are all around us. In the place names we speak without thinking, in the languages still whispered in corners of Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, and in the legends that shape how we imagine the past. These are not relics, they are living traces of a civilization that refused to vanish. The Celts of Britain did not disappear. They transformed. And in doing so, they proved that the deepest roots are the ones that survive the storm. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. If you found this story as captivating as we did, don't forget to like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Sleep Stories TV for more immersive tales from the ancient and medieval world. Until next time, may the old songs guide you and the stories never fade.